Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Kate, and I'm the Sustainability Manager for Tealeaves, and I'm so excited that you're all able to join us today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to Tealeaves Nature X Design, a virtual festival blending internal wellness with the external environment to arrive at a resilient future. For most of us, this conversation is close to home, both literally and figuratively. By 2050, those of us who aren't already will reside in cities. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who joins us today, our cities are still trapped in a linear system, and because of this, they consume over 75% of natural resources, produce over 50% of global waste, and emit between 60 and 80% of greenhouse gases. Now, while cities create a host of problems, they do also provide the ideal platform for transformation, being the hub and intersection point of all of our systems, from food, transportation, goods and services. So to educate us on how we can start to make this transition within our cities, we are joined by a number of incredible experts. As Circular Design Program Lead for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Joe Iles' role is to work with the Foundation's network to inspire and empower millions of designers to create products, services, and systems for the circular economy. Part of the team since 2011, Joe has helped shape the circular economy narrative, crafting stories and messages to reach new audiences and improve understanding. Clare Miflin is an architect and systems thinker with 20 years of experience designing buildings to the highest environmental standards. She led the development of the Zero Waste Design Guidelines for Architects to help New York City develop circular material loops, and works with the Center for Zero Waste Design to adapt and disseminate them to other cities. A biomimicry professional, she founded ThinkWoven, which develops strategies that weave urban systems into ecosystems. An architect and engineer by training, Professor Carlo Ratti teaches at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he directs the Sensible City Lab and is a founding partner of the International Design and Innovation Office, Carlo Ratti Associati. We are tremendously grateful for your time today, panelists, and really look forward to learning from you all. Well, without further ado, Joe, could you start us off and share a little bit about what circular design is to you and how it differs or converges with sustainability and sustainable design?
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and hello to everyone watching, and thanks to Tealeaves for hosting this event and inviting me to speak today. Well, I think the two videos that were just played, one that the animation maybe seems a little bit Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory now with the little folks running around with washing machines. But that just, I think, is just one part of a circular economy. This idea that we might rent and repair more stuff and keep it in use for longer. That's just one part of an economy that, as Tim Brown then said in the second video, is circular by design. And really, when I think about circular design, I really think of a shorthand for design for a circular economy. And what that means is trying to apply the principles of a circular economy into the design and the creative process. So and those principles really specifically are design out waste and pollution. So eliminate waste and pollution from the outset rather than trying to clean it up further down the line. Keep products and materials in use for longer through things like rental and repair and remanufacturing, and yes, recycling when you get to that point. And then the third principle of regenerate natural systems. So if you're thinking about a farming system, an agricultural business, try and put back a bit more than you take out, so that soil, the value of that system increases over time rather than degrades and is depleted, which is the current model in most farming systems around the world. So that's what circular design means to me. It's also about taking a systems view, so zooming into the user, which is something designers are usually pretty good at, but also zooming out to the wider system or systems which are impacted when you create a product or a new service. So that's what circular design means to me, trying to embed those three principles and then taking a systems view. And then in terms of the overlap or convergence, I think you said, with sustainability, I think there are a couple of important differences. and for some, this may be semantics or pedantry. For us at the foundation, it is pretty important. I think one of the limitations of the sustainability movement, perhaps, has been that it has been quite vague, and that's enabled a lot of experimentation and a lot of innovation, some of which is really, really good, and some of it's not so good, perhaps, because the sustainability banner is very, very broad. I think something that circular economy has maybe added has been those 3 principles, which are a bit more specific and give a bit more of a starting point for people getting into designing for impact and having a positive impact. And then I think another important difference is that a lot of sustainability measures are, whilst they might be really good and really important, they're often still quite linear in nature. So if you think back to the pretty mechanistic linear way that animation started, they might focus on minimizing harm or greater efficiency, but ultimately are still based on that take, make, waste model, which if you can make that straight line last a bit longer into the future, a few more decades, that's great. We're going to need some time, but ultimately a fundamentally different model is needed. And I think that's where circular economy comes in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe, for giving us that really strong foundation to build our discussion with. Carlo, jumping off of that point, and with circularity in mind, how can we transition our built environment then to start to resemble natural ecosystems?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kate. I will mention a couple of things. Well, first of all, about the importance of the built environment. If you look at cities, just remember 4 numbers: 2, 50, 75, and 80. Cities are only 2% of the surface of the planet, but they're 50%, actually a bit over 50% of the population today. There's 75% of energy consumption, 80% of CO2 emissions. So if we can do something to make our cities a bit more circular, they can be a big deal globally. And so let me mention these kind of 2 things. The first thing is certainly about materials. There's a lot of embedded energy in all the materials we use in our cities. And again, when you think about when we do a building, really, when we demolish it, then most of it goes into landfill. So that's really terrible. So we're improving, but that is still, like a very linear process. And how can we do this? Well, there's many things we can do, both with traditional materials such as wood. Wood is very good because, again, it embodies, it can contain and store a lot of CO2. And then also, at the end of its life, you can reuse it for other purposes. Or with new materials, like actually a year ago at Milan Design Week. It's a big event about design. It happens every year in April in Milan. We did something called Circular Garden, where we tried to do the largest building ever made out of mushroom. We grew the building in a few weeks before the event, and then after the event, we composted the building back into the garden. It was in a small garden in the core of Milan. So anyway, technology is bringing more and more material we can use in such a way, or reuse old material, like in this case, mycelium, mushroom, or new materials we can design. So first thing, materials. And the second thing, surprisingly, I would say, is about technology and the Internet of Things. Because technology, I'm talking about sensors, about artificial intelligence, about tags, about Internet of Things, and all of that, actually what people usually refer to as smart city technologies, are going to be very, very interesting, because then it allows us to know more about the building, to use it in a better way, to know when you need to change something, maybe not the whole building, you can fix it better. So somehow, going back to your point, technology is making the world of the artificial, the world of cities, buildings, and so on, more similar to the natural world. It's actually allowing us to bring to the artificial world the ability to collect information, like we do with our senses, and to respond to that with intelligence. So again, these 2 points: so first materials, and then bringing intelligence to the built environment.
Wonderful. And I have to ask, out of curiosity, the mushroom building that was made, I know you said after it was composted, did it have a certain definite lifespan? Could it have lasted longer after the festival? Or was it designed for that time?
No, thanks for asking this. So this actually, as I said, is Milan Design Week. Is one of the biggest events in the world of architecture. It happens every year in Milan in April. But usually I'm always frustrated with, big fairs like this one, or like similar ones, where people actually for a week put up a huge amount of things. And usually at the end of the week, a lot of stuff goes to a landfill. And so so basically somehow here we had to do something to a building. The place was also a very beautiful place in the core of Milan. It's called Orto Botanico. So it's traditionally a garden, really in the very center of Milan. And and the garden is a place that traditionally is a beautiful circular place. We get things from the garden, the old gardens, and we bring back all of the waste to the garden. It's a perfect circular system. So we wanted to do a piece of architecture that would be a bit like growing salad. Can we grow architecture from the garden? Can we use 3 weeks with this kind of mycelium to create a structure? And then at the end of the week, where normally a lot of the stuff goes to landfill, actually compost it back into the garden. And nature is so much smarter than us, so we just need to learn from that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's really interesting because there are, I think, so many of those areas that we don't often think about when we're thinking designing sustainability, but there's, or circular design, but there are all these temporary uses that we have for things, and then they have such short lifespans. So if you don't have to build something that will need to last for years and years, that actually probably opens up the variety of materials you can pull from and then make it more circular. So that's wonderful.
Can I add into what Carlo ended with there, which was that nature has so much better designs? I would totally agree with that. That's the whole field of biomimicry, looking at the better designs nature has. But I find it hopeful to remind people that ecosystems don't start off circular. Like after a fire or a volcano, the pioneer ecosystems that come in are really linear in their use of resources. The rain washes off, the sun is not really reused, there's no nutrient cycling. And it's only over time that natural ecosystems become more circular. So if we look to how they do that, again, it's things like collaboration between species, something that I'm sure Joe is so aware is so important in the circular economy. And like Carlo was saying, the intelligence, the feedback loops are really important in making systems circular. We know that about energy. If we get data and information, we change our behavior and use. And with materials and waste, there's really not a lot of feedback loops. So looking at how ecosystems transition, I think as humans, the way we design our systems, looking at these emergent properties is really helpful in order to get to designing cities to resemble natural ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In 2050, it's estimated that our cities will be overpopulated. Claire, would you be able to shed some light on how we might be able to design solutions to this problem, perhaps looking to nature?
Yeah, I think definitely looking to nature is helpful here. And we have to kind of even think of that overpopulated. I mean, I'm in New York City. There are a load of buildings that are empty here because the way we structure things, there's many, real estate is like an investment. There's many, many, many empty buildings, and that is just such a waste. I mean, the Ellen MacArthur have even looked at office space. They're unused 35% of, they're only used like 30 or 40% of working hours. I mean, so overpopulated, there's a lot of unused assets. Maybe it's just not that they will be overpopulated if things were distributed properly. So currently cities are linear use of resources, they have centralized infrastructure and a lot of unused assets. So if we can convert the way cities function to be circular, to have decentralized infrastructure and good use of our assets, then maybe they're not overpopulated at all. And we have to, I also always like to keep in mind the half Earth idea of E.O. Wilson, that we need a lot of interconnected nature in order to have a healthy planet. So density of inhabitation is a good thing, but maybe it doesn't need to be so centralized. And New York City is already looking at it. And rather than having a central downtown and less density as you go out, you have these intense nodes around transit hubs, and people work and live in a similar area, and maybe they can bike and they're part of a larger city, but they don't travel to a central spot every day. So I think designing from urban planning to buildings to systems in that way can help solve for the future of cities.
Wonderful. I know that right now, of course, the way that we're even using our cities is very different with the current pandemic that we're all experiencing. Carlo, would you be able to touch on how you think the pandemic is changing either the way that we interact with our cities or the way that we're going to need to alter some of our designs or concepts moving forward?
Sorry, myself. Yeah. Thank you, Kate. And I want to add to what Claire was saying. So yes, we can use our assets much better. And that applies to buildings for sure. Buildings are used only a fraction of the time. Think about but all the urban infrastructure. In the extreme case, think about the mobility infrastructure. A car today is used on average 5% of the time. And 95% of the time is not used, is actually using valuable space in our cities because it's parked somewhere. And you know what? That 5% of the time, you probably have a big SUV, which is a 5-seater or a 7-seater, and on average, there's 1 or 2 people in it. There's 1.6 usually. And so if you multiply that, you see we got an infrastructure that has a huge cost in terms of resources. We need a lot of steel, a lot of plastic, a lot of rubber, a lot of energy to do all of that, with an efficiency of, say, 2% or something like that. Now, and the same thing as Claire was saying applies to buildings, to all the empty buildings we've got in our cities and so on. So certainly we can improve the utilization. That means, we actually use resources much better. And well, how do we do it? Sharing is very interesting. So like with cars, if you go to car sharing, you can usually remove 30 cars from the street, up to 30 cars from the streets with just one car, which is being shared by different people. So I think sharing is a very important thing. And the other thing, going back to your point and your question about what the pandemic taught us, is something that I would call is flattening the curve of the city. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, if you think about what we've been doing over the past few months, has been flattening the curve. Flattening the curve, I did my lockdown in the United States, flattening the curve, we would hear it every day, which means that we actually try to reschedule things so that we don't get saturation. In the case of the pandemic, we talk about saturation in the healthcare system, so that basically the hospital system doesn't collapse. Well, but the same approach can be applied to most things in the city. So by flattening the curve of the city means that if we are a bit flexible, and certainly the pandemic has taught us how we can be more flexible in commuting, for instance. We don't need to be back in the office every day at 9 a.m. Maybe on Monday morning, some of us might connect via Zoom for the 9 a.m. meeting and go to the office at 2 p.m. Other people might go home earlier and connect for the last meeting of the day. So we got to be more flexibility. If we play it right, it's a huge asset because it means we can flatten the curve of the city in many dimensions. Think about traffic, think about energy consumption, and the impact of that cannot be underestimated. It's something that's very common, for instance, with power utilities, and actually in some cases, if you just reduce the peaks by 10%, you can slash capacity by 50%. That means that basically being able to flatten the curve a little bit can have a huge impact on our cities and on how they consume resources, how they can be more circular. So again, I think this thing, this flattening the curve mindset that we learned during the pandemic, perhaps if we transfer it to urban studies, can actually help us to more sustainable cities.
I just add to that. I think the pandemic has really revealed how the lack of adaptability or the adaptability that will be needed as we move into what's next. And if it, like Carlo alluded to, if it includes a lot more home working, what's the impact on that for us who will be working from home? Do our homes set up to do that? And in the meantime, is there a large amount of office building stock that is now going to go unused? It probably wasn't designed for adaptability for upgrade, there may be still a significant opportunity to renovate and repurpose buildings if we get creative about it. But I think it place the emphasis, in my mind, on designing with future adaptability and upgradability in mind.
Yeah, and I'd like to address that waste, because people are really worrying that the pandemic will lead to so much more waste and garbage and disposable usage. But I think it really just teaches us that we have to have safer systems. Like, instead of bringing our own cup to Starbucks to get it filled every time, we need to have systems of reusable cups that are filled for them in the restaurant, and then you drop off in other places. And those are actually starting to be available here in New York. We can get a delivery of food in a reusable container that we drop off in a network of restaurants. So it's really also looking system-wide. Like, as we said, the linear system means that, I mean, here in New York City, it made so evident that the people who suffered most from COVID were the ones that had the worst air quality. And that's because of the linear system. That's because of the peaker plants Carlo was saying, that just do a little bit of energy and give out loads of pollutants, or the trucks for the waste. And so if we really have decentralized systems and we're doing composting and making the city greener in a decentralized way, the air quality will be better and we'll have better outcomes from the pandemic, or any health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's great that we're touching on the fact that this pandemic has brought about opportunities, such as the ones that you've mentioned, and definitely the ability to work from home. I know for myself personally, means a lot less travel and carbon footprint in that aspect. I am curious to know everyone's thoughts on, for example, I know, Carlo, you brought up car sharing as a really wonderful way to have people not buying as many cars, better usage of that resource. Do you think it's going to take a while for people to shift their behavior back towards that, where I think there was quite a large increase in engagement before the pandemic because of, maybe hesitancy around using something that a stranger might have used prior? Or is that really just maybe a flaw in the system of, we need to have better practices in place where it's cleaned and there's just those standards put in?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And yes, I think we need to separate between two phases. We've got a phase that hopefully will not be too long, maybe 6 months or 12 months, nobody knows exactly. But that's a phase while we need to live together with the virus. And yes, you're right, the sharing economy might suffer a little bit. I think we can do a lot of things. We can look at, disinfectants and so on, but certainly it will suffer a little bit. But certainly, if you look at the past, all the previous pandemics, and our cities have gone through much worse pandemics in the past. If you think about Venice, in the 14th century, it lost 60% of its population, 60%, 60, because of a pandemic at the time, because of the Black Death. And then we had cholera just over 100 years in many cities in Europe. So, if you look at that, then, after the pandemic, people went back to using public space and sharing in a similar way. So in the long term, I don't think we're going to see sharing suffer. I don't think we need to think about redesigning public space. And if you look at the past, the past can be organized. If anything, if you look at the last, probably the last big pandemic, the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, 1918, well, what happened after that? We had the roaring 1920s, the roaring 20s, which were a time of incredible urban life and partying and really social interactions on steroids. So I think, after this phase of coexistence with the virus, I don't know how long it will last, but hopefully it will end soon. Then, I think we'll go back to intense urban living, and certainly I believe also to intense sharing. And that makes total sense if you think about a more circular city, as we were saying before. Yeah,
I would just add to that I think some of the trends that we've been seeing over the past decade, especially in terms of the time that we've been working on circular economy, these trends shouldn't be viewed as like some of the digital trends that Carlo mentioned earlier on, Internet of Things, some of the sharing practices, they're completely intertwined with circular economy. I wouldn't say that they're happening because of circular economy. So some of these sharing models are happening. Yes, they might make better uses of resources and energy, but also they may just be better for the customer. They're a better service. They enable us to not have the burden of owning a car and taking care of the maintenance and the fuel, and finding somewhere to store it all the time and insuring it, all those things that to many are seeming increasingly burdensome. And you could see the same for clothes. So clothes rental is starting. It's still a bit niche, but more and more companies, some of the incumbents are trying it now. And the idea of not having a wardrobe full of clothes that you don't wear is appealing to some. And we've seen something similar happen with media, switching from owning stacks and stacks. Behind me somewhere, there's a box of CDs that I haven't looked in for probably about 10 years because now I access things on Spotify. And I'm not saying that Spotify is like a circular economy case study, but some of these trends were already existing. And I don't think they'll take a massive knock through COVID, and I think the idea of the Roaring Twenties comparison was kind of appealing. I would also just add that the circular economy and some of these new business models, they already imply some design tweaks. Like if you were renting a car, you probably wouldn't need some plush leather seat, like 100 different settings for the mirrors and in the entertainment. You might just want something that's basic, durable, and can take a bit of a beating when it's used by 100 people in a day. And you'll see that a bit with some of the bikes that, like in San Francisco with the bike share there, and we have the same in London. These things are heavy, they're durable, they require less maintenance, they're easier to repair. So maybe COVID and the need for items that are easy to sanitize and maintain from that standpoint, maybe that'll just become another design factor that we carry forward.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that, and definitely on the reusables for eating. But I think also in terms of space, like I actually work out of a co-working space that is a network of restaurants that are not used in the day, and it's popped up that you can have co-working. Now that is going to take a while to come back because we don't even have indoor restaurants open again yet. But if we think of the risk, it's really because there isn't such good healthy air quality in buildings. And as architects, we've designed buildings like schools in New York City often don't have functioning ventilation systems. So designing for healthy interior air is something that the pandemic can teach us, so we can have more intense use of spaces again. So it's really teaching us how to do things properly as well. And also I think that we will transition. At the moment we think of coronavirus as something that has to be killed, but then we will, in a kind of using bleach and the control methods, but we know a lot about the microbiome and how healthy microbes make it less likely for unhealthy ones to multiply. And I think we're going to see a lot of research in how we can make spaces healthy through having a healthy microbiome within them rather than sanitizing everything with wipes every 5 minutes.
Yeah, actually, maybe Kate, to add to what Claire was saying, there's a project we've been doing at MIT over the past few years, which was kind of try to see the microbiome of the city. Now, we know the human microbiome is for every cell in our body. We got around 9 or 10 bacteria and viruses living with us. It's something we just started seeing over the past few years, thanks to metagenomics. And but what we can do is actually start to see it in the city. And then we started looking at sewage and look at all the viruses and bacteria in sewage, which is kind of our collective, microbiome. If you look at the neighborhood, sewage is collecting all of our microbiomes, and again, you can sample it and analyze it. Now, a couple of things I wanted to add to Claire is that, I think that is going to be a very important dimension we need to monitor tomorrow, actually. And we know that actually just destroying and killing all the viruses around ourselves is also having a negative effect on all these kind of colonies living with us, because we destroy, yes, coronavirus, but also a lot of positive viruses and bacteria. And we know that a lot of issues of inflammation are related to the diversity of the microbiome inside us. And the other thing is that if you're able to measure that, then we can think about a much more precise way to intervene in cities. And actually, out of this piece of research we did at MIT over the past few years, a startup came out called BioBot. And BioBot actually over the past few months has been very busy in order to look at COVID into sewage in over 300 cities in the United States. So somehow, again, if you think about what we were mentioning before, that sensing and intelligence and feedback loops can help us to create a healthier and more circular city. Well, in this case, we should probably more and more start to quantify and characterize this kind of invisible landscape of viruses and bacteria, both for health directly, looking at pathogens like we're doing with, with COVID, but also more generally to look at the ecosystem, which is which then results in the microbiome that makes us healthy or not.
Wow. I think it's wonderful. There's so many parallels between, I mean, of course, there's a connection with human health and environmental health, but there's just so many of those parallels between the natural world and the built environment. There's so much we can learn from it if only we choose to look. Claire, were you about to say something?
No, I was just saying that was a great example. I love the work MIT and others are doing on the microbiome, and recently I've been reading about healthy soils. Like if we composted more in cities and the soil's microbiome was healthier, they've actually shown that makes people healthier. So there's so many interconnected systems. It's so inspiring to find out more about.
It kind of reminds me of...
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, thanks, Carlo. Kind of reminds me of some of the work we've done on cities and food specifically at the foundation, and found that that the health impacts caused by the linear food production methods, in terms of economic impact, are equal to the health impacts from obesity and malnutrition. So the way that we currently make food with because it's linear and requires large amounts of fertilizer and pesticides to prop that system up, to keep it going, because we're degrading soil for the most part. Those actually have a significant negative health impact, which is vastly overlooked. So there is a connection here as well in terms of harnessing all the nutrients in cities and organic material specifically, and cities accumulate so much of that material, feeding it back to farms and the places where food is grown. Lots can be grown in the peri-urban region around cities. Creating some of those nutrient loops could not only be a better use of materials, of use of resources, but it could actually have a health impact for us as well. And it's pretty significant.
Yeah. Kate, but I was distracted a little bit by looking at all the great questions that are coming in. I don't know if you want to start commenting on some of them. But I saw one that I thought was very interesting. A lot of them are very interesting. I wanted to perhaps comment on one of them. Is about, we're seeing a lot of people move out of dense cities, but we also know that density is very good for many other metrics. So density is very bad for a pandemic. And we've seen it over the past few months, but density is usually very good. If you actually plot on a chart, you find many of them online, the amount of energy per capita in different cities, and on the x-axis you put density. You see the most dense cities in particular, such as Hong Kong, are the ones that are the most sustainable ones, because in a dense city, we can share much more. We need less infrastructure per capita, which means we can be more sustainable and more secure. And so I saw the question, and again, but I want to mention something a bit, in the line of being hopeful, that yes, perhaps over the next few months we'll see still a lot of people moving to the Hamptons from New York, or to suburbia, to Connecticut. But I think the cities will come back. So I think this is not the end of cities. This is not the end of density. There might be a few ways, but cities have come back so many times in the past, and I think it will be the same this time as well.
And that's a really interesting point, because I know what we talked about a little bit earlier is that definitely, you know, as recently as just a few months ago, all the trends really had been pointing to cities being overpopulated and everyone living there. There is a little bit of that movement now, I think, with the ability to work from home remotely and whatnot, that people are, as you said, starting to engage in spending more time in rural spaces. But it's interesting to hear your perspective that you do think it will continue on that projected trend. And it's true that cities do provide the opportunity for better efficiency and better use of resources. So there is definitely a benefit there.
Yeah, and it has actually shown that cities haven't fared worse. High density cities have not been worse in COVID overall, especially in the US. And Hong Kong, for an example, is a good one. But even New York City it's not worse than suburban spaces, because it's really not a function of the density of the city. It may be a function of overcrowding of interior spaces, but then that is to do with equity as well. So, and we can design for that.
And flattening the curve as well. So
yeah, as Carlo was saying,
when we're engaging, you know, in public spaces and those resources, so that the crowds are better managed. And Joe, I know you were just touching on some of the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is doing in particular with food systems, but I know you're doing a lot with cities overall to start to transform them to be more circular. I was wondering if you could share perhaps a case study there, or really dive into why it's important that when we're talking about cities and that transformation, the circularity piece is really key.
Yeah, well, I think we've touched on quite a lot of it already, actually, and certainly the case for change. I think Carlo's numbers 250, 75, 80 that were mentioned at the top of the session, they represent a big part of the argument. So half the world's population currently living in cities. That is growing, even in spite of COVID in the long term. And as a result, cities accumulate stuff. They accumulate resources. They have a thirst for energy. They create large volumes of waste. But they also accumulate some good stuff as well: people, knowledge, and skills. And I think that this really, for us, really, we think, and for many others, I mean, we're not alone saying that cities are hugely important. I think everyone on this call would agree that the opportunities kind of have two angles. That if all the waste is ending up in cities or is generated by cities, then that's a really urgent problem and an opportunity to create value from all that stuff. And then with so many people in cities and so much knowledge there, then there's arguably a good chance to address they're a place to address some of these complex challenges. So with the food work that I mentioned, for example, circular economy for food in cities, we explored the notion that rather than seeing cities as the end point, this black hole that just sucks in resources, that they're actually the node at which point that line starts to become more of a circle. So a really important moment in the kind of transition to a circular economy. I think as well, they're an amazing place for experimentation. We're just talking about density, and I think the close proximity of citizens, of retailers, service providers makes new business models and piloting some new business models possible. And we've seen that a lot in recent years with something like car sharing we've mentioned, bike sharing, and the technology dimension is really interesting there. I think that bike sharing was tried in Paris before everyone had an iPhone in their pocket. And it didn't really work because you couldn't really see if you walked 10 minutes to a docking station, were there going to be any bikes available? Could you book one in advance? So technology's made some of those very urban, connected, and circular business models much more possible. And you mentioned case studies. Some of my favorite ones that are really fundamentally urban are like the Library of Things in London, the Toronto Tool Library. Are you in Toronto now, Kate?
I am.
Yeah, there you go. You could go and rent a drill or something. And I think these are really exciting examples. They which I was speaking to Ryan, who founded Toronto Tool Library, and he was saying something like he knows that he needs maybe 12 or 13 drills for a population of 1,000 people. And that's kind of nice to be able to manage those assets and keep them in use for longer. Maybe they buy higher quality drills so they can maintain them over a longer period of time and rent them to more people. So there are some practices, circular practices, that are only really possible to experiment with in cities.
Absolutely. And that's a great example. I think for myself personally, I do not use those tools too frequently. So it would make sense to, from time to time when you're putting a piece of furniture together, it's not something you need on a daily basis. So why not have it be something that you share? You can save money. And then
what a lot of people do when they have to buy something they don't really want to buy or they don't really need, they buy the cheapest one. And then it breaks, and then they have to buy another one. So some of those models can flip the incentives so that the service provider or the manufacturer designs something that will last for longer because they're going to rent it out.
Absolutely. I love that case study. And I think what's really interesting about some of the examples that you mentioned is they do require some behavior change on our part. Carlo, would you be able to also jump in on that, and what behavior change do you think we will need to adopt in order to support these circular cities, and how drastic do you think that behavior change needs to be?
Well, if you look at what we've been saying from different angles so far, a lot of it is related really not to owning things, but to sharing things, to going from ownership to accessing something, and that can apply to many parts of our lives. And I think that's all great, but I think kind of potentially clashes with something which is what Thorsten Veblen, a great sociologist from over 100 years ago, would call conspicuous consumption, to something to the fact that, that if you look at the 20th century, people have been consuming also for the sake of showing off. You get a big flashy red car to move to the city, not really because you need it. If you think about this, for instance, I think there's no city at all on the planet where you might make use of the capabilities of a Ferrari or a Porsche. But still, people still buy it and drive it for things that would be perfect with a very small car, just for the sake of what Thorsten Veblen would call conspicuous consumption. Now, and I think that to me is a big fundamental question. To me, there's a bit of hope that again comes from the internet. And I did an op-ed in The Guardian together with Richard Sennett, who's a sociology. Richard and I teach a class together at MIT. And the hope is that because today we can also transmit experiences, maybe we don't need to own things anymore. In the 20th century, the only way you could say something about the things you care about, the fact you had money or whatever, that was by consuming physical things. Today, we can do much more by just taking a selfie, by saying what we care about. And it can be food, it can be other things. I mean, we still want to be conspicuous. I think that the fact of being conspicuous is something that's probably encoded in humans, like Thorsten Veblen hypothesized. But I think we can probably do it with bits more than atoms. Now, if that is the case, it could be good news for the environment. But there's a big if. I don't know. I hope so, but I'm not 100% sure.
I hope so as well. And we are approaching the end of our more formal question time now. I do want to make sure we have time for audience questions. I know there's actually quite a lot that have been submitted, so thank you everyone for that. So to end us in this section, my last question is, how can attendees be a part of this transition? So we've talked a little bit about behavior change and some of those pieces, but what would you say are some of those call to action items that you have for our attendees? And perhaps we'll start with Joe, and then each of the panelists can share their points.
Sure. Well, I think you've helpfully put them on the screen now, so I won't just read through that. But I think what people can do, and we get asked quite a lot, well, show me a good example of circular design, or how can I apply circular design to a product? We hear this a lot from students or from businesses, both small and large. And I think the call to action from me is to try and get started. We find it much easier to understand what circular design is, or understand what the circular economy is, if you can just get started, roll up your sleeves and have a go yourself. And you don't have to be a designer by training. One piece of research we did internally at the foundation was that we had this hunch that there's a lot of stuff around us, right? We have a lot of things, from laptops and phones to buildings and food systems. There must be a lot of people involved in designing those, in shaping them, what they're like. So we reckon there's about 160 million people globally who influence materials flows in their work. And some of them are called designers and some of them aren't, whether they're material scientists, founders of startups, and so on. So you don't have to be a designer, but I think trying to get to grips with what the circular economy means is the best way to actually to explore it. And one really good way to do that is through systems mapping. So you could take any product that you use every day and just try and map out what the system in which that fits, whether it's a sandwich or a pair of sneakers or a smartphone. And it can be a really enlightening process to understand the complexity of the world around us and the things that we use. And it can be a great way to start spotting circular design opportunities. So in one of the links there in the circular design toolkit, that's kind of a bit of a gateway to lots of the design resources we've produced over the years, including the things in the circular design guide, which Tim mentioned at the start of the session today, Tim Brown. So that would be my call to action, to try and get started with some experiments, even if it's just doodling on the back of a napkin.
Wonderful, thank you. Claire.
Yeah, I mean, as an architect, I worked on the zero waste design guidelines, and these are really set up for anybody who manages a space in a building, whether it's a restaurant or designs a building or as an urban planning, that we really need to design our spaces to enable circular systems. So if that's you, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. On another personal level, I have seen that many people in circularity have gotten involved often through composting, because it's a kind of mindset change that composting helps foster. Like when you're throwing everything away as garbage, you really don't want to think about it because it's kind of disgusting. But once you start thinking about it, and if you separate your food scraps, you then think, oh wait, maybe I shouldn't have thrown this bread away, I could have made bread pudding, or you start to repurpose and make less waste. But also you see that process of creating soil, and whether you do it on your own level or in a city, you're more likely to do it in a community garden, and that has other participation and social benefits. But I think it really changes the mindset of waste just by participating in composting, especially if it is done in a community garden where there's vegetables grown, and you just become aware of circularity in a mental way, but also in a kind of, you feel it, and how humans could play a positive role. I mean, it's not just, I mean, we creating compost, but that can create healthy air quality, enrich trees. It reduces the amount of stormwater that here in New York City and many old cities leads to sewage going straight into the ocean. It leads to air pollution by waste transfer stations. When you think of all the harm it can do and all the benefits that can come, I think it starts making you behave in a different way.
I might actually sneak in one more question for you, Claire, that I had wanted to ask a little earlier, but I know we are short on time. You talked about, those amazing benefits really from the environmental perspective. And you mentioned a few earlier, but I was wondering if there are any that you really wanted to highlight in regards to benefits that by engaging in these practices, we can experience beyond environmental.
Well, I think we've all talked a lot about the health benefits, but I would argue there are a lot of social benefits. I actually love the organization in the UK, Participatory Cities, which set up these open storefronts that were just open for anybody to go in, have a cup of tea, come up with an idea for their neighborhood. And that could have been, they were everyday things like cooking bread together, dyeing fabric together, anything. as a way to participate. And most people do want to participate in making their neighborhood better, but there are all these things that make it difficult. Not enough time, the legal aspects, not enough space. And as an organization, they really made those go away. And they've been researching how it helps people in terms of mental health, social health, how happiness, everything really gets better if people can all participate in becoming more circular.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that and for indulging me in my extra question. Carlo.
Yeah, our lab at MIT is called Sensible City Lab. And Sensible is really about how we can start by sensing, by better understanding the built environment, our cities, in order to make change. So I think I echo what Joe was saying is about, if you start looking in your daily life about how you can understand better what is circular, what is not, and improve it. And really looking at this, if you scale up from the individual level to the level of the community and to all of the citizens, that's a key thing. So somehow, is here on the slide, but basically starting from bottom-up dynamics, enabling bottom-up dynamics, thanks to new technologies that allow us to better sense what is going on around our sites.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, panelists. I have taken up a lot of your time now, so I will allow you a few minutes to take a look at the audience question and answer section. And if each of you want to pick, we'll start with one each and see how much time we have left. Feel free to jump in as soon as you find a question that you're ready. I think, Joe, do you perhaps have one?
Yeah, I've had the luxury of having a little bit longer to look than Claire and Carlo. There was a good one about a golf course. What are the useful things a landfill can become other than a golf course? As we transition into a circular economy, can the waste stream become an asset other than traditional recycling streams? I think this one just highlighted for me the importance of the design component here. That ultimately we don't want to be getting to the stage of wondering what we can do with landfills because we're trying to design them out from the beginning. And I think, it places the emphasis on, we talk about these inner loops of a circular economy, that especially when you're thinking about technical materials, things like polymers and metals, things like that, durable items, that we should be increasingly trying to think of these inner loops. And by that, I mean things like maintenance, sharing, repairing, remanufacturing, refurbishing, and recycling, increasingly trying to see that as a last resort. And it's usually the first option for many businesses and even us as citizens today. Recycling is kind of positioned as the good thing to do, and of course in many cases it is, but sometimes it can be a distraction from the much higher value and much more impactful activities in these inner loops. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you took a car or a building or an electronic device, a TV or something, and you stripped it back down to its component, to its materials. And you hear this from businesses quite a lot, right? They say, we take back our products, we turn them into raw materials that we can use again. And it sounds good, and sometimes it is, but you're stripping away all the value that you added to those materials to turn them into a building or a TV in the first place. All that energy and labor that went into getting that into being a product and in someone's hands or in their home. So that's why we really encourage businesses and individuals as well to think about these inner loops of maintenance, sharing, reuse, rather than the recycling loop.
That's a great point. And I know for us, of course, as a tea company, it's definitely a challenge with it being something that people can really only consume at one time, and it doesn't have that capability of some of the other things that we had, such as the sharing models. So for us, we've really been trying to do that, learning a lot from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as well. For example, with packaging, how can we move past just recycling to packaging that's home compostable and will actually go back into the earth, and as much as possible really be a part of that circular process and maintain value.
I'll just say some more word on that, and then I'll shut up. But because there was another question around extensive use of plastic during the pandemic, and that's not just a pandemic thing. The single-use plastic has a place still, for better or worse, in medical scenarios, for example, when you need something to be completely hygienic and it isn't suitable for reuse, or for people to if someone can only afford to buy a small amount of a product at a time, then, and not buying in bulk, then buying in a small sachet maybe has been the necessary way to do it. For me, that just places the emphasis on the redesign opportunity, whether looking at delivery methods, formats, or materials. Are there new ways to provide that service without the single-use option?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was actually going to go to that question. It's a two-part question. It talks about how the extensive need of plastic during the pandemic, like, will we always trash nature in moments of crisis? And then it asks how developing countries could hasten the process of building back if they didn't have these infrastructures in the first place. And I would say those two are connected. And yes, because we don't want to build these central infrastructures of creating waste and landfills, there is definitely some advantage from not building centralized linear infrastructures and going straight to circular distributed ones. And countries like Bangladesh or Kenya that have banned plastic bags are then set up to develop those other systems. And Kenya, I think, has also banned the dumping of like all Western countries' crappy textiles because it was decimating their own amazing textile industry. So when developing countries kind of say we're not going to accept the end of this linear system, and then we have to deal with how to manage it, and instead we're going to set up circular systems of better quality materials that we can maintain. I think that's how it's done. And I think that's a really good point. Definitely not to follow the way we've done stuff in the West in a linear way. It's a huge opportunity not to do that.
Absolutely. Carlo, did you have a question that piqued your attention?
Sure, I was inspired by a little bit of the conversation about bikes and, and city bikes, and I wanted to comment on them from a slightly different point of view, because it has been mentioned that, yes, and actually here, the question or the comment is about the Montreal system. Before Montreal, yes, there was the Paris system, which actually was prototyped in Lyon initially. Then went to Paris. In Paris, it was working very well for local people, a bit less well for tourists, because you get to register and so on. It was called the Velib. It was active until last year for, I think, around 10 years. And then we started having all the dockless bikes. And, the dockless bikes led to a few big companies, a few unicorns, a few startups valued over $1 billion US. Mobike, Offobike, Obike from Singapore. And actually we ended up with another problem in the case that they started flooding cities with bikes, and we ended up with this, something people hadn't heard of before, called bike pollution. And then now is that there's another way, which is about scooters, electric scooters. Well, some of them went bankrupt, some of them were acquired recently, but now there's a next generation of scooters. So what I wanted to say here is that innovation is about trying things in doing trial and error. And now, say 20 years ago, during the .com era, it was easy. You could trial and error could happen just digitally, and then you get out of the process, you get the winners, the Google, the Amazon, the Facebook, and so on. Well, now it's a bit more difficult to do it in the city. So one of the things we need to learn in order to innovate in the city is also how can we have some healthy cycles of trial and error without really having the city collapse or end up with very bad consequences. And I think this example of sharing mobility, or overall the umbrella is micro-mobility, over the past 5 or 10 years is a good example of how we went from one system, which was like the French one with docks, to the dockless system, to e-bikes, to e-scooters, and now to the next generation scooters. And how some cities did better than others is something where we need to learn how to make sure that this kind of feedback loop happens also at the level of the city, with innovators on one side and cities being able to respond quickly. So I think that those comments on mobility brought to mind this, which is more about the methodology. How do we innovate in tomorrow's cities?
Great. I was actually hoping I could jump in with a particular audience question that piqued my interest. Some of you might be familiar that Tealeaves is heavily involved in the biomimicry space, and that's actually how we initially met Clare. And this is a question that came up for Clare that I was really curious to know the answer to, which is, cities are inevitably built with concrete, a material with high carbon intensity. Any biomimicry ideas that can help replace this basic building material?
There's definitely some biomimicry ideas about changing concrete, because you can coral is made from carbon dioxide in the air, oil dissolved in the water. For concrete you could take carbon dioxide in the air and make it into carbonates and solid materials. So there's ideas to do that. It's not yet by any means close to becoming carbon neutral. So there's lots of other ways of improving concrete as one. Another is to use ground up glass instead of cement. But there's a big push in sustainable architecture. I'm co-chair of the Committee on the Environment here in New York City. Big push to building with wood, which has better carbon footprint, but there are huge impacts. And before, a lot of sustainable architects are pushing to building with wood without really looking carefully at where the wood's coming from. In many cases, they're using kind of general numbers for forestry without really looking at the specific case. And I would say, always think of building less to start with wherever you can, and how much more do we need to build, and how much, so looking at other options. There's a lot from biomimicry and circularity we can look at to build less. I mean, there's building materials that Carlo was talking about, the ecovative or the mushroom mycelium materials. There's a lot, but I think we really need to think systematically where those materials come from before we declare them as good based on some life cycle analysis.
Joe or Carlo, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think just on that last point is one that we hear quite a bit from designers and architects and innovators, who sometimes it can be a bit paralyzing, trying to choose between some material or strategy just based on a kind of cold metric. Or just one metric, because so many of these challenges that we're facing are really complex and intertwined. So, and I actually have a lot of sympathy for people in that decision, trying to do good or make good decisions in a system which fundamentally is set up is fundamentally linear and set up for negative outcomes on the whole. I don't know if anyone watches the show The Good Place. There's a sitcom called The Good Place. Ted Danson, great performance in that, by the way. But he gives this great speech about how it's really hard today to buy, even just to buy a tomato, because people are stressed themselves out, considering how was it produced? What was the energy impact? Was it flown from far away? Was the treatment of the people involved in the growing of the tomato sufficiently just? It's really challenging for us as citizens or innovators to make the right choice. So I think on that note, starting out with the values that you want to take into your creation, be it a building or any other product, is a great place to start. And for us, the values or principles that we would suggest are designing out waste, keeping stuff in use, and regenerating natural systems. And then you'll be able to get to something that you can measure a bit further down the track. that's what I would encourage for people in that position.
Yeah, I'd definitely echo that, Joe. As someone formerly paralyzed by a mimicry, had a big kind of, okay, that is a vision and a goal, and your 3 principles are pretty much the same as
for sure
ecosystems. It's great. Yeah.
And I want to say, going back to these points, sometimes things are not as simple as they look. We all know we want to have, locally sourced things. But I remember reading a piece of research that came out, I think, a couple of years ago about the fact that lamb from New Zealand is actually 4 times less energy intensive than lamb that you can get in the UK, just because the way it is produced there, and then the travel doesn't add that much energy to the overall balance. So I think that's more and more important that we look more at data and we have transparency about data so we can make better decisions. Because it's there's not a single principle fit all. We heard it about recycling. We heard it, and the same is about what we eat or how we behave. So we need more data in order to make better decisions.
Thank you so much. We're actually at the end of our time now. I have gotten totally carried away with this conversation. It's been so interesting and really inspiring and hopeful as well. So thank you so much to all of the incredible panelists. Thank you so much to our audience for spending your Sunday with us. I know, at least from our panelists, we're everywhere across North America and Europe, so I'm sure our audience members are as well and beyond. So thank you so much wherever you are for spending this time with us.